The Conservative government was appealing that highly disputable decision. The incoming Labour government, for reasons it's never disclosed, chose to drop that appeal and subsequently has laid a draft remedial order to amend the legislation. Now, the problem with this, Mr. Speaker, is that earlier this year, the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement was granted permission to intervene in the case before the Supreme Court. And on the 15th of October this year, Lord Wilson Casey, acting for the movement, did just that and gave written and oral submissions which the court are now considering. Consequently, it's entirely possible that the declarations of incompatibility relied on by the Secretary of State to lay the remedial order will be quashed. The case is very much live, and this is very important because under Section 10 of the Human Rights Act, a government only has the authority to use a remedial order unless and until all appeals in relation to declarations of incompatibility have been determined or abandoned. This test is not met. And if the government decides to push ahead with its remedial order, not only will it be acting ultra vires, it will set a terrible precedent which will mean that future governments may use remedial orders in ways that they were never intended to use. To avoid this, all the government needs to do is to commit to not pushing its remedial order to a vote until the Supreme Court has finally ruled. Will the Secretary of State make that commitment?
Very well done. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the point that he has raised, but I would say to him that the argument he puts is not correct. The appeal was abandoned by the government in July 2024, and he says, for reasons that have never been disclosed, the government has been absolutely clear from the beginning, we disagree with immunity and we are committed to repeal and replace the Legacy Act. And Section 10 gives a Secretary of State the ability to make a remedial order when a declaration of incompatibility has been made and any appeal has been determined or abandoned. It has been abandoned by the government. Now, the honourable gentleman has suggested that the ongoing Supreme Court appeal in Dillon means that the conditions have not been met and therefore suggests that we may lack the vires to lay this order. I do not agree with his assessment and have made the position clear to the honourable member in the correspondence that we have had, I think an exchange of 2 emails and 2 letters. I can confirm to the House that in July 2024 the government formally abandoned its appeal concerning the declaration of incompatibility relating to immunity from prosecution. That declaration was not part of the appeal that is now before the Supreme Court. And the fact that the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement was granted permission to intervene does not alter this legal reality.
Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last month, the House debated the Troubles Bill and we heard many moving contributions about the devastating loss experienced by families, including military families, many of whom are still seeking answers. Does the Secretary of State agree that the voices of those of the government's legislation, what it's for, should be at the forefront of our minds when we debate it and every time we debate it? Thank you.
I do agree with my honourable friend, and I would just further say that the honourable gentleman who speaks for the opposition and the principal opposition party remain, it seems, wedded to immunity, which was well, the honourable gentleman says once again, as he does in all these debates, conditional immunity. I think the last time we debated it, I reminded him what the legislation of the last government said. It said that the Commission must give immunity if the conditions for giving immunity are met, which are quite clearly, well, the honourable gentlemen have not reminded themselves of what their legislation said. All that was required was that for somebody to come forward and to say what they had done, and if what they had done was an offence, then the Commission must grant them immunity. And I would say to the opposition that at some point they do need to recognise that that provision for immunity for terrorists Because the last government said we wish to give immunity to terrorists, had no support in Northern Ireland. And I'm sorry that they don't recognise that, because I've said on many occasions, progress cannot be made in trying to deal with the problem of legacy when the provision that is in the current legislation, which we are committed to repeal and replace, has no support in the place that suffered more than anywhere else during the course of the Troubles.
Can I remind colleagues, if they wish to ask a question, they should be bobbing and try and reduce chuntering from the front benches. I ask the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Dr Alpinkerton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the introduction of a remedial order is welcome and necessary, even if its timing is potentially vexed. This remedial order promises to finally end the policy of conditional immunity that was integral to the 2023 Legacy Act, a policy that may have had benign intentions, but which did put us at odds with our international legal obligations and which regrettably drew a moral equivalence between UK service personnel and terrorist paramilitaries. I note the Joint Committee on Human Rights' second report, published last week, which recommended its approval. However, I also note that committee's concern regarding the unusual sequencing and timing of the remedial order in relation to the forthcoming primary legislation. Now, given the overtly political processes that led to the 2023 Act, there is an additional responsibility, I would suggest, on this government to ensure that this process is handled properly and that the process, as much as the policy, is seen to be fair-handed. There is a broad recognition of the need to repeal and replace the 2023 Legacy Act, but we also need to acknowledge that the removal of conditional immunity has created real anxiety, particularly among veterans groups. They fear the risk of prosecution. And so I also welcome the Secretary of State's letter circulated yesterday, Annex A in particular. So can I just ask the Secretary of State, if I may, three things. First of all, to clarify...
You have exactly 1 minute and you've gone over, so my apologies. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for what he said and for the support that he gives to what we are seeking to do in the remedial order. I acknowledge the responsibility that the government has. These are quite unusual circumstances, and the reason that we are here debating this is because the Joint Committee on Human Rights has acknowledged those unusual circumstances, and despite having made other comments in this report, which we will all have read, has come to the conclusion that they give their approval to this and have recommended that the House support it. And I welcome what the Joint Committee on Human Rights has had to say. I would also point out one other thing. The government, and I'll acknowledge this, did take a bit of time between the JCHR report on the 28th of February and producing the revised draft remedial order on the 14th of October. I just wish to inform the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the reason for that is that we had listened to the representations that have been made, particularly from the other side of the House, on the subject of interim custody orders in respect of sections 46 and 47, and in relation to the Supreme Court judgment in 2020. We reflected on that and we found what we think is an alternative way of achieving the same objective, and that is to be found in clauses 89 and 90 of the Troubles Bill that is currently before the House. And I would simply point out that the last government tried for 2.5 years to find a way of dealing with the Supreme Court judgment in the Adams case, was not able to do so, eventually accepted. The amendments moved in the other place that became sections 46 and 47, but it was acknowledging the arguments have been made that led the government, to amend the remedial order, which we then put before the House on the 14th of October.
Deputy Speaker, as a member of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, we published our second report on the Northern Ireland Remedial Order on 9th of December. The standing orders of both houses require the JCHR to scrutinise all remedial orders. The committee concluded that the virus of the order was satisfied and that all statutory requirements were fulfilled. However, the committee also felt that the circumstances were that it was only appropriate because the government gave compelling reasons about why this would have to come forward in this way while a bill was progressing through the House, and there was a Supreme Court case ongoing. Does the Secretary agree with me that, that although the circumstances and the timing are not ideal, this is the best way forward?
Well, I do agree with my honourable friend. The circumstances are unusual, but the government does believe it has a compelling case, and the JCHR agreed with the government's assessment. Yeah.
Father of the House.
There's been a lot of very complex legal arguments alluded to today, but I think what the public are concerned, what I'm concerned about, is the state of mind of our veterans, some of them quite elderly, who only sought to serve their country decades ago. So the Secretary of State is a very moderate, clever, reasonable person. Given that there's really, in reality, no chance of a successful prosecution, and people would be horrified if there was a prosecution, what comfort can the Secretary of State now give to our veterans?
Well, I agree with the right honourable gentleman that we only have to look at the figures to see that the prospects of any prosecutions in any cases are increasingly remote because of the passage of time, the difficulty in obtaining evidence. But what the government has done, having listened very carefully to the representations that veterans have made, has been to set out in legislation the protections, and we will return to the House when we consider the bill in committee. Protection from repeated investigation, the right to stay at home, to seek anonymity, protection in old age, protection from cold calling, and the right to be heard. And I hope that when veterans get a chance to see precisely how they're going to work, the fact that they are contained in the legislation, they will reassured that the government is looking out for their interests.
Member Adam Jogi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it's always important for Northern Ireland to be discussed on the floor of this House. We are, after all, one United Kingdom, so I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for putting the question to us. But we must never forget the people of Northern Ireland. So can I ask my honourable friend what recent engagement he's had with victims, survivors and other organisations representing them as part of his work to address the legacy of the past?
I have had many such meetings. The Victims and Survivors Forum, for example, I've met twice in the recent past to explain the legislation that the government has published. I would make the point that there is a great lack of trust on the part of victims and survivors in Northern Ireland who feel they've been let down many times before. And trust undermined it's very hard to rebuild it. They are taking account of the legislation the government has passed. It won't surprise the House if I say I believe it does provide a foundation for moving forward. But it's really, really important, as my honourable friend has said, that their voice is heard and heard loudly.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 12th of November, I raised with the Prime Minister the alarming statement from 9 former generals that attacked the government's approach to lawfare against our armed forces. They said it would erode trust in the justice system and it was a threat to national security. Can the Secretary of State confirm if the Prime Minister has met with these 9 former generals, and has it changed his approach to attacking veterans?
Well, I don't accept the characterisation that the honourable member puts before the House. The government is not engaging in lawfare against veterans. Well, I refute. I've read that letter and many others. I refute the suggestion that the government is engaging in lawfare. We have been meeting a very large number of veterans' organisations. I myself have met the SAS Association and others. Ministry of Defence ministers have met. We are listening, and the House will see when we come to committee stage the results of those considerations, because the government is absolutely determined to ensure that there are proper protections in recognition of the hugely important and dangerous role that those who served in Operation Banner performed in trying to keep the people of Northern Ireland and indeed of the United Kingdom safe.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a member of the JCHR, I'm concerned that the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary may have inadvertently misled the House when he suggests that our committee did not discharge our role seriously and consider all of the evidence in this case when we produced the report. The report which we produced recommended that this remedial order be made in no small part because of the incredible sensitivity around anything to do with the Northern Ireland Troubles and the need to make sure that we are building bridges across communities, and in no small part too, may I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, because of the seriousness with which the committee feels the Secretary of State takes this issue. It is therefore quite right, I believe, that the Secretary of State make this a remedial order. Does he not agree that it is not right, not serious politics, to play party politics with such a delicate issue?
Well, I would say to my honourable friend, who is a distinguished member of the committee, that I am grateful for the support that the Joint Committee on Human Rights has given for the remedial order and for the government's assessment of the compelling reasons. And personally, I'm not accusing anybody of anything else. I want to try and get this legislation right, as I've said to the House many times before, and I will work with all honourable members who will join me in that task.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is perfectly entitled to pursue a policy desire of removing immunity. Indeed, he knows that my colleagues and I support that position. We found it quite difficult that yet another government was prepared to offer a different variation on immunity for the perpetrators of terror in Northern Ireland. We find that repugnant, so we support the notion that immunity should not stand. But that's not the question before the Secretary of State today. The question before the Secretary of State is whether he should misappropriate a remedial order process, which is about dealing with the incompatibility of human rights law, not incompatibility with his policy objectives. So for as long as a question still remains before the Supreme Court, which it does, though it's not his appeal, it is the Northern Ireland Veterans Movement, is it not better, given he's acknowledged there is an issue of trust on this issue, that he should just at least wait?
I would say two things to the right honourable gentleman. Firstly, I would reject the suggestion that I or the government has misappropriated a remedial order or misapplied Section 10 of the Human Rights Act. And I would cite in aid of that argument that the JCHR, whose job it is to scrutinise, well, he shakes his head, it is their job to scrutinise. If they had come to the House and said, we don't think the case is made, well, the government, of course, would have respected that. That is not what the JCHR said. The second reason is time is not waiting for the victims. It is not. And that is why the government thinks. There are those I've spoken to say, well, as long as it's still on the statute book, even though it has been declared incompatible, we doubt whether we can trust the process. And having decided, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep the Commission but to reform it, I think it's right we remove that uncertainty as swiftly as possible, and that is what the remedial order is seeking to do.
I think the whole House can agree this is a very serious and sensitive topic. Can I ask members to be mindful with their language and ensure that they're not heckling whilst they are seated? I call Select Committee Member David Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State, you've already confirmed that under the Legacy Act, the immunity provisions were never commenced, and so therefore it's important to say that nobody ever was granted immunity under them. But sticking with the subject of immunity, the three Veterans Commissioners for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have all said they do not call for immunity under the law, but fairness under it. Does he agree with them?
I agree with that statement completely, which is why I must confess my disappointment that the opposition is still clinging to the notion of immunity, including immunity for terrorists. The Veterans Commissioners are quite right. They want fairness, and that is what the government is determined to deliver.
Sir Edmund Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I just simply say to the Secretary of State, it does seem like ridiculous haste when the Act is going through right now, and that surely to do this when he knows for a fact that there is already an appeal going on does, as has already been said, become abusive in terms of the real purpose of a remedial order. And I suggest to him really that for all the stuff about the fact of people being let off, all to do with the fact of immunity,
That's not the issue. The issue today is, are they misusing their powers to rush something through which they could have dealt with through the course of this Act?
Well, I make 2 points to the right honourable gentleman who served with such distinction in Northern Ireland. Is first of all, as we have just heard, immunity was never commenced. It was declared incompatible. It was also struck down under Article 2. And I reject again the suggestion that the government is somehow abusing the process. If that was an argument, then one might have expected the Joint Committee on Human Rights to have agreed with it. It did not. It heard all of the points that have been put, and it concluded that in these particular circumstances it was right to proceed, and that is why it is recommending to the House that it should support the remedial order.
Katrina Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This week's exhibition in the upper waiting hall is a memorial quilt produced by members of the South East Fermanagh Foundation. It's a very moving way to remember those who have been innocent victims of terrorism. The dates on those quilts panels remind us how long those families have been fighting for justice. Can I ask the Secretary of State what message he wants to send out to every person who has produced one of those quilt panels for SEF, but also to all of those other families from this statement today?
Well, I met on Monday night with the families who'd come over for the unveiling of the quilts. Could I say to all members of the House, if you haven't had a chance to go up to the upper waiting hall to look at them, I would urge you to do so, because the story they tell is profoundly moving, but is a reminder of the continuing search for justice that so many people in Northern Ireland have got. And I would look at those quilts and say it is an argument for what we're trying to do to secure legislation that can actually help find those answers for all those people who are remembered on the quilts that are upstairs.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In regards to the Secretary of State and the accusation about rushing this through, he will be conscious of an Irish government that isn't rushing anything through in regards to the support, in regards of what's actually doing. Yesterday, the Justice Minister in the Republic of Ireland received permission from the government to draft priority legislation to enable state bodies to give oral evidence to the Omagh inquiry. Madam Deputy Speaker, that was only because the Omagh families are taking legal action. Can I ask the Secretary of State what engagement he has had with the Irish government, actually in regards to bringing forward legislation that matches what is he bringing forward to this place? And can I actually ask him, who's he dealing with at the minute? Because it used to be the Taoiseach Simon Harris, who's now been promoted, or is it the Justice Minister who's bringing forward this, or is it the new FDA Minister?
Well, my most recent meeting, and I have many meetings with Irish ministers and discussions with the Taoiseach of the Taoiseach, was with Helen McEntee, who has just taken over from Simon Harris at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. I very much welcome the fact that the Irish government has announced that it's preparing to draft the legislation, as Simon Harris had committed to me while standing next to me, in time for the next hearings of the Omagh bombing inquiry, because that is evidence that the Irish government intends to fulfil the commitments it's made in the joint framework.
Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to commend the Secretary of State for the care he's taking to be as fast as possible for those victims, survivors and veterans' families who need to hear answers, but the care that he's taking to make sure this is legally correct. And I would echo the comments about the South East Fermanagh Foundation quilt in Parliament today, which reminds us of the need to get those answers for families. And can the Secretary of State confirm that he's concerned, as I am, that the opposition are just interested in making political points rather than really building peace, which is what we need to do together as members of the House? And would he confirm that the remedial order removes what would have been immunity for terrorists?
Well, I would say to my honourable friend, I think all members of the House have a shared commitment to trying to ensure that the peace that Northern Ireland has enjoyed since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement is maintained. All of us do. We have a difference of view about in some respects, about the right way of seeking to do that. And I am always willing to be challenged on the arguments that I put on behalf of the government and to challenge the arguments that I hear from the opposition front benches. In the end, we know that we have to deal with this because the last bit of legislation failed to achieve, as someone said earlier, whatever its intentions, failed to achieve its purpose. It did not command support in Northern Ireland, and that is why we have to make progress.
Sir Julian Lewis.
May I just ask the Secretary of State to clarify whether his earlier remarks mean what I think they mean, which is that even if it had not been for the guidance of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, the government would anyway wanted to have repealed the legislation of the Legacy Act. It's a political decision, and given that he said that he did not believe that there would be convictions at the end of this process, does that not mean that there will be several, if not many, trials? And if no one is convicted at the end of the process, how does that help anyone? And how does it avoid just torturing the people who are put through the trials?
Very good. Well, if I may just correct what I think was the interpretation that the Right Honourable Member was putting on what I had said. I made it quite clear a moment ago. Had the Joint Committee on Human Rights reached a different conclusion about the appropriateness of the remedial order, the government would of course respect it. I also made clear in my earlier comments, this government came into office committed to get rid of immunity. We've been quite clear about that from the start, and the remedial order will seek to give effect to that. If one looks at the figures, we've discussed prosecutions of veterans. There has been one successful prosecution of a veteran since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. One. And the point I was making is, if you look at the figures, well, there are currently 9 live cases before the courts relating to the Troubles. 7 of them relate to paramilitaries, 6 of those relate to the provisional IRA. And I've heard the argument from those benches opposite, oh, well, none of the paramilitaries are getting prosecuted. That is not the case. It's really important that we have these debates on the basis of facts.
Jim Allister.
The Secretary of State doesn't need me to tell him that he and the government are struggling to command veteran support for his bill. Could I therefore ask him, in order to address that deficit of support, should he not consider an amendment to Clause 3 to have the Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland serve on the Legacy Commission? Wouldn't that be a token of making good on the Secretary of State's affirmation that this is about capturing the confidence of veterans and not pursuing lawfare against them?
Well, as I've already indicated, I reject the suggestion that the government is in any way engaging in lawfare against veterans, in the same way that I reject any suggestion there are such things as politically motivated or vexatious prosecutions. Well, the honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position, oh, come on. I've heard those words from opposition members in previous debates on these questions. There will no doubt be a number of amendments and suggestions made when we come to detailed consideration of the bill, and we will consider them at the time.
Sir Geoffrey Cox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder if the Secretary of State can assist me with this problem. The Supreme Court is at the moment seized of the issue as to the lawfulness of the declaration of incompatibility. The fact that the government has withdrawn its appeal does not prevent the Supreme Court from ruling on it. Let us suppose the Supreme Court rules that the declaration of incompatibility is void. Suppose that would mean, therefore, that that legal position is that the declaration of incompatibility would be void. And therefore the basis on which the order that the Secretary of State is proceeding on would be removed. Surely it would be prudent to wait to see if the Supreme Court rules on it, because otherwise what he will be doing is proceeding with an unlawful order. I wonder if the Secretary... I mean, I'm asking in the spirit of genuine curiosity and inquiry, not political partisanship. If this is going to bring this entire process into disrepute, if what he's doing is in fact acting upon an unlawful basis.
Well, once again, I would say I don't accept that the government is acting on an unlawful basis. Given the honourable gentleman's distinguished legal credentials and experience, I would say to him, I note that he encourages me to speculate on a potential, well, he does, on a potential outcome. The government has to deal with the position as we find it. I've already set out to the House why the government is absolutely clear in its view that because the appeal was withdrawn, we are able to make use of Section 10 of the Human Rights Act in order to remove conditional immunity.
Sarah Potin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton highlighted the need to recruit people into our armed forces in order to protect this nation. My question to the Secretary of State is, how does he expect to do that when those that served gallantly in Northern Ireland face prosecution? Why would young men and women join our armed forces with the risk of that happening to them? What message does that send to those young people?
I would say to the honourable member, I meet many young people in my constituency and other duties who are very keen to come and serve the nation in the armed forces. I am not aware of any figures that suggest that there has been a decline in recruitment. If she's seen them, perhaps she could draw them to my attention, because trying to get dealing with the past right should not affect the willingness, particularly the threats that we face in the modern world, from encouraging young people and others to come forward and serve the nation as people have done over the centuries.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State has spoken of additional protections in his legislation. Why does he think that Operation Banner veterans, some of whom I represent, remain unconvinced and remain troubled? And why does he think that the Irish Prime Minister believes that there are no additional protections? And whilst he's about it, can he do something to reassure veterans who are feeling very unhappy with this, perhaps along the lines of saying categorically that no former terrorists or members of proscribed organisations will serve on the Legacy Commission?
Well, I've already made it clear to the House that those who have engaged in paramilitary activity, as long as I'm in this post, have no intention of appointing them to any of the posts that are contained in the bill. On the protections, I think we all have a responsibility to explain and to point out that they are in the draft legislation in clauses 30, 31, 36, 91, 84, 54, 56, 69 and 8. They are real, tangible protections, and they do respond very directly to the concerns that veterans have raised with the government. The reason we've introduced them is because of our determination to make sure that veterans are treated properly.
Alex Easton.
Deputy Speaker, Secretary of State,